Montana Territory, 1892. While neighbors rushed to finish their timber cabins before winter, one Finnish homesteader was just getting started on something they'd never witnessed. He built a second wall around his entire dwelling 14 inches out from the logs, filled with loose grass and dried moss. His neighbors called it a fence around a house. They called him wasteful. A perfectly sound single-wall cabin with tight ceiling was all any settler needed, they said. He kept building anyway, adding vents at the roofline and a drainage gap at the foundation, while they shook their heads. Then the winter of 1892 arrived early. Blizzard winds hit 40 miles per hour, driving snow through every seam and fissure. Inside standard cabins, water froze solid in buckets just feet from the fire. Families burned through cord after cord of wood and still woke to 8 degrees below zero indoors. But that Finn's homestead, with the peculiar double wall, morning after morning, his interior stayed 23 degrees warmer than what his neighbors measured and documented. What did he grasp about wind, still air, and thermal loss that everyone else rejected as wasteful madness? If you appreciate tales of proven wisdom that survived harsh reality, be sure to subscribe. We have more verified stories worth your time. The Finn reached Montana Territory in early summer of 1892 with 3 crates, a broad axe, and concepts about construction that his new neighbors would spend weeks mocking. Virtanen had grown up in Finland's interior forests, where January cold settled into valleys like stone, and he'd learned young that one barrier seldom held back what the elements demanded to steal. His uncle had constructed grain storage buildings with dual planking and air pockets, and Virtanen himself had worked autumn seasons at the Helsinki cold storage, where they layered wood shavings between interior and exterior walls to preserve winter locked inside through August heat. Now claiming his land on the high plateaus, where wind traveled unbroken for 1,000 miles, he intended to build identically. By mid-July, Virtanen had his timber up, a 16 by 10-foot structure with 8-foot walls, sealed tight and firm like every other settlement in the valley. His neighbors acknowledged approval and assumed he'd continue to clearing brush and digging irrigation ditches. Instead, he started placing pine posts 30 inches apart in a precise square 14 inches beyond his timber walls. The district supervisor, a man called Henderson, who'd been in these mountains since 1884, rode up during his monthly circuit and questioned what on earth Virtanen was constructing now. "Windbreak wall," Virtanen answered, verifying his level against a post. "Like they use for cold preservation." Henderson spit and frowned. "That's a barrier circling a dwelling, pure waste of good timber." But Virtanen continued his work. He shaped support braces from rough-cut stock and secured them between the posts every 40 inches to maintain his outer framework straight and stable. Along the foundation, he preserved a 1-inch opening for water drainage and covered it with metal mesh to secure his insulating material in position. The complete framework consumed him 5 days of precise measurement and cutting. And by that point, rumors had traveled through the valley that the Finn was constructing something strange. The exterior layer rose in vertical planks, 1 by 12 milled boards that Virtanen had special ordered from the Missoula sawmill. He installed them ground to roof line and sealed every joint with 1 by 4 strips positioned 14 to 20 inches apart. At the roof line, he fashioned a modest overhang and covered it with sheet metal to direct snow melt away from the space. Beneath the overhang, he created a 3/4-inch vent opening to allow humidity to escape from whatever he intended to pack between the walls. "Resembles a fortress for a dwelling," remarked Ellen Cooper, the valley's postal carrier, when she passed by in mid-August. But she spoke with interest rather than scorn, and she paused to observe him labor. "Still air," Vertanen clarified, indicating toward the 14-inch gap. "Flowing air robs warmth. Captured air preserves it." He'd absorbed this concept not merely from cold storage, but from discussions with a Blackfoot elder who sold beadwork at the trading post. He told him about lodge liners, interior barriers of hide that formed a quiet zone between the wind-catching outer covering and the occupants inside. The liner captured a layer of motionless air that remained warmer and eliminated the drafts that made winter dwellings unbearable. Virtanen had considered his explanation and understood he could incorporate the identical principle into solid walls. Through late August and into September, while his neighbors completed grain threshing and started stockpiling firewood, Virtanen harvested and dried wild grass. He constructed drying frames from leftover lumber and dedicated days collecting dried moss from riverbanks, spreading it thin to cure under the sun. The grass he trimmed short and loose, understanding he required material that would capture air without compressing. Solid. He estimated roughly 140 cubic feet of fill for the space around his dwelling walls, and he wanted every portion of it dry as bone and light as feathers. "That grass will decompose by New Year," predicted Henderson during another inspection. "Rodents will inhabit it. You'll have the entire wall filled with pests." "Cold storage uses wood chips," Virtanen responded. "Remains dry if you ventilate it properly." By October, the ridicule had developed into a constant rhythm. Every settler in the valley held a judgment about the fence circling Virtanen's dwelling, and none of the judgments were positive. They labeled it wasteful because he'd consumed 1,400 board feet of lumber for an exterior skin that provided no structural function. They labeled it senseless because everyone understood tight ceiling and a strong fire were everything any structure required. They labeled it excessive because the space between walls was broad enough to stand in, and who required that much empty volume around a perfectly sound timber house? But Virtanen persisted. He packed the space methodically, compressing the loose grass and moss to approximately 4 to 5 pounds per cubic foot, dense enough to remain stable, but light enough to capture maximum air. At the upper section of each wall segment, he fastened canvas as a wind barrier to stop the fill from settling and forming cold zones. For entries and windows, he mounted the exterior planks like shutters so they could open for entry but close tight against elements. The labor consumed him 9 weeks total, which was 2 months longer than most settlers needed to complete a structure entirely. His neighbors observed him toil through September warmth and into October chill, questioning the effort and expense he was investing in a problem that didn't exist. When the first frost whitened the ground in late October, and Virtanen was still fine-tuning his roof vents and entry seals, they assumed they'd have evidence soon enough that one solid wall surpassed 2 questionable ones. What they failed to comprehend was the science Virtanen had learned from cold preservation and borrowed from native wisdom. A winter storm wasn't simply frigid. It was moving air under force. That movement generated penetration through every seam and fissure, defeating whatever insulation a single wall might offer. but an expendable outer barrier could absorb the wind's power, while a still air cavity disrupted its flow. The principles were valid, the materials were tested, and the measurements were exact. By first frost, Virtanen's dwelling was prepared to prove what his neighbors dismissed as the winter fantasy of a determined immigrant who didn't recognize when to cease building. The first challenge arrived sooner than anyone anticipated. November 3rd delivered 40 inches of powder snow in 20 hours, pushed by winds that twisted fence rails and tore bark from aspens. The storm materialized without the typical warning indicators. No cloud formations in the northern sky, no pressure change that experienced settlers could sense in their joints. One day the plateau lay brown and prepared for winter. The following, it vanished beneath drifts that reached structure roof lines and concealed wagon tracks entirely. Henderson woke that first dawn to discover ice nearly 2 inches thick in his water bucket, positioned just 5 feet from his burning stove. The interior walls of his dwelling wore a layer of frost, where his breath had condensed and frozen throughout the night. He loaded his stove until the metal glowed dull red, but the cold simply consumed every bit of heat before it could reach the spaces where his family huddled beneath blankets. 3 structures down, the Cooper family faced identical circumstances. Ellen's husband, James, had reinforced their chinking in October and installed new door weather stripping, confident their dwelling would handle whatever winter delivered. By sunrise of the second storm day, they were burning wood faster than sustainable rates and still couldn't maintain interior temperatures above freezing. Their youngest child, barely 8 months old, developed breathing difficulties from the severe cold, her small lungs struggling against air so frigid it hurt to inhale. Across the valley, similar situations developed at every single walled dwelling. The Morrison family, with an elderly grandfather whose circulation had declined from years of outdoor labor, observed him growing dangerously lethargic as their interior temperature dropped below zero, despite continuous fire maintenance. The school teacher, a woman named Rebecca Stone, recorded interior temperatures in her journal, documenting overnight lows of -8 degrees just 10 feet from her stove, while outdoor readings reached -35. But at Virtanen's structure, conditions developed remarkably differently. He woke that first storm morning to discover his water bucket showing surface ice approximately 1/4 inch thick. Uncomfortable, certainly, but manageable. His interior walls held no frost coating. His breathing generated no visible vapor clouds. The thermometer mounted beside his door frame indicated 34 degrees. A complete 42 degrees, warmer than the outdoor reading his weather station recorded. He maintained his typical fire routine, burning wood at rates he'd established during milder weather. As the day advanced and the storm intensified, his interior temperature settled around 38 to 40 degrees. Cold enough to require warm clothing, but far above the life-threatening conditions his neighbors battled. More crucially, the temperature remained steady. His walls weren't hemorrhaging heat into the screaming wind outside because the wind never contacted his structural walls. It hammered his exterior planking, penetrated every crack in that sacrificial barrier, and then died completely in the 14 inches of still air and dried grass that formed an impenetrable buffer zone. By the third storm day, when Henderson rode through the valley checking on households, The contrast became impossible to ignore. At the Morrison place, he discovered the entire family gathered in one corner, huddled around a stove consuming wood at triple normal rates, while the grandfather shivered beneath every blanket they owned. At the Cooper dwelling, he found Ellen desperately trying to warm her infant near the stove, while James split wood in a frantic attempt to maintain their dwindling heat. Then he reached Vertanen's place. The Finn answered the entry wearing a single wool shirt, working at his table on harness repairs as though winter wasn't attempting to murder everyone in the valley. His interior felt cold by comfortable standards, but Henderson could speak without his breath fogging, and the floor beneath his boots held no ice despite the door opening to admit him. "How?" Henderson demanded, gesturing at the thermometer reading 39 degrees. "My place hasn't reached 20 since the storm hit." Vertanen set down his leather punch and walked Henderson to the wall. He knocked on the interior timber, solid and frost-free, then pushed open one of his exterior shutter planks. Wind roared into the cavity between walls but went no further. Henderson could see the dried grass insulation still dry and loose, filling the space. He could feel the temperature difference, brutal cold in the cavity, relative warmth inside the structural wall. The wind hits the exterior barrier, Vertanen explained, penetrates it completely, but then it reaches still air that won't circulate. Can't steal heat from air that doesn't move, can't reach the interior wall where warmth actually matters. Henderson studied the system for several minutes, his practiced eye taking in the details. The exterior planking that bore the storm's assault, the precise spacing that maintained the air gap, the ventilation slots that prevented moisture accumulation, the whole assembly that transformed a brutal environmental attack into manageable indoor comfort through nothing more complex than dead air and dried grass. "Can you assist with retrofits?" Henderson asked abruptly. "The Morrison grandfather won't survive another night at current temperatures. The Cooper infant needs warmer conditions immediately." Vertanen was pulling on his coat before Henderson completed the request. Within hours, a coordinated emergency response developed that would preserve 3 lives and alter valley construction practices permanently. Vertanen, Henderson, and James Cooper assembled at the Morrison dwelling, with every scrap lumber piece available in the valley. They couldn't replicate the complete double-wall system in the middle of a blizzard, but they could implement the essential principle using available materials and desperate speed. They started with the northern wall, the one bearing the storm's primary assault. Using rough planks, fence pickets, and even dismantled wagon sides, they constructed an exterior barrier approximately 8 inches from the Morrison's timber wall. The construction was crude. Gaps existed where better carpentry would have sealed tight. But precision wasn't the objective. Creating still air was the objective. They packed the cavity with everything available: dried grass from Vertanen's surplus, straw from the Morrisons' bedding supplies, even wool clothing too worn for other use. The material didn't matter as long as it prevented air circulation within the gap. They worked through failing daylight and into darkness, guided by lanterns, driven by the knowledge that the grandfather's life measured in hours without intervention. By midnight, they'd completed the northern wall and started on the eastern exposure. The Morrison family, observing from inside, reported temperature increases they could feel. Subtle at first, then progressively obvious as the retrofit eliminated the worst infiltration points. By dawn of the fourth storm day, with 2 walls retrofitted and a third partially complete, the interior temperature at the Morrison dwelling had climbed to 18 degrees. Still brutal, but no longer immediately lethal. The grandfather, wrapped in blankets near the stove, showed improved color and responsiveness. The Cooper dwelling received similar treatment the following day. The infant's condition had deteriorated during the storm's peak, her breathing shallow and labored, her skin showing the bluish tint that indicated dangerous cold exposure. Rebecca Stone, the schoolteacher, had medical training from her years in Chicago and recognized the symptoms of hypothermia advancing beyond reversal in single-wall conditions. Virtanen's retrofit approach for the Cooper place prioritized the sleeping area where the infant spent most hours. They constructed a smaller, double-wall section, essentially a heated box, within the larger structure, using every insulating principle Virtanen understood compressed into the fastest possible implementation. Exterior barrier, still air gap, fibrous fill, vapor control, all assembled in a 10 by 12-foot section that transformed one corner of the Cooper dwelling into a survivable microclimate. The infant's recovery began within 8 hours of the retrofit completion. Her breathing steadied, her color improved, and she stopped the weak crying that had terrified her parents for 3 days. Ellen Cooper, holding her daughter in air that had climbed above freezing for the first time since the storm began, wept with relief that transcended words. The storm persisted 6 days total, establishing records that would stand for decades. When it finally broke, 13 people had survived extreme cold that would have killed some of them in single-wall shelters. The grandfather lived, the infant recovered, and families returned to their own claims with direct knowledge of what thermal stability felt like. More significantly, they carried practical methods for achieving that stability using materials and techniques within reach of any settler willing to invest the labor. The emergency retrofits remained in position through the remainder of winter, providing measurable comfort improvements and fuel savings that confirmed the double-wall principle under actual conditions. What had started as one man's excessive construction had transformed into a valley survival strategy, proven not through debate, but through the simple reality that people stayed warm when wind attempted to freeze them. Spring arrived early in 1893, but by then the requests for construction details had already started. Henderson was the first to inquire, appearing at Virtanen's entry in late March, with a notebook and a measuring tape. He wanted dimensions, spacing intervals, and a complete materials list. Not for himself, he claimed, but for his cousin, who was planning to settle the following year. Virtanen provided the information without commentary. 14-inch cavity minimum, pine posts at 30-inch spacing, support braces every 40 inches, 1 by 12 planks for the exterior skin with 1 by 4 battens, 3/4-inch vent slots at the roof line. Rebecca Stone made the second formal request, this time for inclusion in her annual report to the Territorial Education Department. She had documented the thermal performance through 2 major storms and wanted to preserve the technical details for other frontier teachers who might face similar challenges in remote schoolhouses. Virtanen walked her through the entire system, the metal mesh screening at the foundation gap, the canvas wind barrier above the loose fill, the sheet metal flashing that directed meltwater away from the cavity, the hinged exterior shutters that provided storm protection for windows and entries. By summer, 4 of the 9 nearby settlements had ordered lumber for permanent double wall construction. The Morrison family committed first, investing in a complete retrofit that would protect their grandfather through another winter. They selected a 16-inch cavity instead of 14, using wood chips from the Missoula mill, where grass was scarce. The wider gap allowed for denser packing while maintaining the still air principle that made the system effective. The blacksmith who serviced heating stoves throughout the valley noted practical differences at dwellings with double walls. He discovered fewer smoke backup issues and steadier drafts because the interior walls existed in calm air rather than fighting constant pressure variations. His repair visits decreased significantly at double-walled structures, and he began recommending brick sleeves for stovepipes and improved door seals to settlers attempting their own versions of Vertinen's method. Construction details spread through informal networks rather than formal instruction. Neighbors observed each other's building techniques during barn raisings and harvest cooperation, noting gap widths, fill materials, and ventilation strategies. The Johnsons opted for an 18-inch cavity filled with a mixture of wood chips and moss, reasoning that wider spacing would provide superior insulation despite higher material costs. The Stones chose 14 inches, but used all wood chips, following cold storage practice more closely than Vertinen's original grass and moss combination. Results from the second winter validated the method across multiple implementations. Rebecca Stone kept detailed fuel consumption records for all 4 double-wall dwellings, documenting 30 to 45% reductions in evening wood requirements to reach 50-degree interior targets. More importantly, none of the retrofitted homes experienced frozen water containers indoors during storm periods, and all maintained pre-dawn temperatures above 15 degrees throughout December's worst cold snaps. The Cooper infant thrived through her second winter, showing none of the respiratory distress that had nearly killed her the previous year. Ellen Cooper attributed the improvement directly to consistent interior warmth that allowed the child's developing lungs to function normally rather than fighting constant cold stress. The grandfather Morrison lived to see spring and credited his survival to sleeping in air that stayed above freezing throughout the night. Maintenance requirements proved manageable but consistent. Exterior plank skins needed rebattening every 4 to 6 years as weather loosened the strips that sealed vertical joints. Grass and moss fill required replacement every 3 to 4 years, particularly after wet seasons when moisture penetrated the cavity despite ventilation slots. Wood chip fill lasted longer but cost more initially, creating a trade-off between labor frequency and material expense. The method's reputation spread beyond the immediate valley through correspondence networks that connected frontier communities. Territorial agents began including double-wall construction details in their agricultural bulletins, treating the technique as proven field practice rather than experimental innovation. The approach aligned with established cold storage insulation methods, giving it technical credibility that helped overcome resistance to frontier improvisation. By 18 out of 6, the double-wall principle had appeared in formal agricultural extension publications. A correspondent for the Montana Homesteader wrote detailed articles on still air insulation, complete with diagrams showing proper cavity widths, fill densities, and ventilation requirements. The technique was described as particularly valuable in high wind regions where standard sealing could not prevent infiltration during severe weather events. Modern building science would later validate every aspect of Virtanen's original method. Still air remains the fundamental insulating principle in contemporary construction, with moving air destroying thermal resistance while trapped air providing it. Fibrous materials like straw continue to demonstrate respectable insulation values by preventing air circulation within wall cavities. High wind infiltration still overwhelms inadequate thermal barriers, making wind-resistant construction essential in exposed locations. The physics Virtanen had borrowed from cold storage practice and native wisdom became standard frontier survival knowledge within a decade of his first double-wall dwelling. Settlers throughout the northern plateaus adopted variations of the method, adjusting cavity widths and fill materials to local conditions while maintaining the core principle of sacrificial outer walls protecting structural inner walls through still air barriers. What had begun as one Finn's excessive preparation became documented best practice for extreme climate. Construction. The method required more initial labor and materials than single-wall building, but the thermal performance and fuel savings justified the investment across multiple building seasons. Most importantly, families stayed warm and survived weather that had proven lethal in conventional construction. The legacy lived in practical terms rather than grand recognition. Children grew up healthy in consistently heated homes. Elderly members survived winters that would have killed them in drafty structures. Fuel consumption dropped to sustainable levels that preserved precious wood supplies for essential uses beyond heating. On the plateaus, where wind never stopped testing what settlers built against its force, Virtanen's method had removed the teeth from winter before it could reach the wall where people lived and families endured.